interest in doing vegetable production completely indoors. So you would, in those situations, you'd also have to supply the light. And there's been some new technologies, new developments with the use of LED lights that allow you to control the wavelengths in terms of, the proper wavelengths for plant growth. And they work a lot cooler. In the past, folks that were growing plants under lights, a lot of times they'd use things like high pressure sodium lights, which generate a considerable amount of heat and are difficult to work with and manage. So some of the newer lights that they're coming out with are going to be a big game changer, I think, in a lot of ways, particularly for urban production. Another term that's oftentimes used is aquaponics. And that's where you're combining fish production with plant production. And the idea here is that the fish, they'll, the tanks that they're in, they're pooping in the tanks, and that the water is then pumped into a hydroponic system to grow plants. The advantage of that is that you're dealing with two commodities. You're producing both fish and plants. Typically the fish are tilapia, which are an easy fish to grow. And then the plant production is probably going to be something along the lines of a leafy green, basil, those kinds of things. There's not much you can do in terms of adding fertilizer for your plants in this kind of a system because it might have detrimental effects on the fish. So there's advantages, disadvantages to it in terms of what kind of plants that you can grow in this kind of a system. But it is another method that is being used in some cases. So in terms of the structures themselves, mostly these hydroponic production is done in greenhouses. The greenhouses can be can be very expensive. They can be covered in glass. They more likely are going to be covered in some kind of plastic. And there are both rigid plastic types, things like that are, escape me what it's called. But anyway, there's rigid plastic that you can use, corrugated fiberglass kinds of things. The plastic that's used on most of the houses it's usually some kind of plastic that has been specifically formulated for greenhouse production. So you're going down to your local, Home Depot or Lowe's or what have you and picking up just plastic sheeting, it's not going to work. The plastic that's used on greenhouses is specially formulated to resist, UV damage and things like that. And even in those cases, the plastic has to be replaced every 4 or 5 years. The other plastic I was thinking of, polycarbonate plastics, are rigid plastic. They're oftentimes a bi-wall to increase the insulation. In terms of the structures themselves, everything from galvanized pipe, wood, PVC have been used. Heating and cooling systems are oftentimes installed. Heating is usually done with gas, either natural gas or propane. And the cooling systems use evaporative cooling. And I got some pictures I can show of that here in just a minute. So some of the things that have been done with these kinds of production systems is the houses will have relatively high ceilings in many cases. They're sealed to prevent insect entry. So they don't just have mosquito screening on any of the outlets. It's a very fine screening to prevent even the smallest of insects from getting into the house. They'll oftentimes have a vestibule to control entry. So you'll have to enter a small room, close the door behind you before you're then allowed to go into the greenhouse. You'll oftentimes step through a sanitary solution to sanitize your shoes. It's oftentimes using passive cooling, high pressure misting. These kinds of things, they don't work in pad and fan cooling. They don't work as well here in the Southeast as, out west in the desert Southwest or places like that, or in the Middle East, where the air is very dry. And under very dry environments, evaporative cooling is very effective. In the Southwest, a lot of people don't have air conditioners. They use what they call swamp cooling, which is, having some absorbent material that you have water dripping on that absorbs that water, and then you're pulling air from the outside across that wet surface, and it cools the air. You can, under dry, very dry environment, you can drop the temperature 20 or 30 degrees. Fan jets are oftentimes, and I'll show some pictures of that, fan jets are for air circulation, are reworked to operate on the floor rather than above the plants. The picture there is a production facility where they're producing tomatoes, and they've just, it's probably been a few weeks since they've planted them. The plastic bags that you're seeing that are laid down on the ground are filled with perlite, which is that white, lightweight material. You can, oftentimes if you go to your garden center, you can buy that kind of material in small bags, but obviously in a commercial operation, you would get it in bulk in large quantities, and the plastic tubing is filled with that. And then the irrigation is all by drip irrigation in a system like this. So to look at some, this is a greenhouse that has the dark area that you see on the side here. These are cooling pads that would be soaked with water, and then exhaust fans will pull the air from outside over those cooling pads, and drop the temperature. As I say, if your air is dry, it works very well. If not, here in the Southeast, we have a lot of humidity and what have you. It works okay, but not as well as it can in other drier regions. Some others, these are glass houses, so a lot more expensive houses. This was actually taken in South Korea, in the southern part of the country, in a place called Busan. And a little background, so Georgia has about 14, 15 million people. South Korea has about 55 million, and it's about 2/3 the size of Georgia. So a lot of people on a relatively small footprint. Consequently, every square foot of land that needs to have something growing on it that they can use, they do. So in the foreground there is rice. In the winter months, they'll drain those fields and actually plant onions there. But those are some glass houses that are there on the right, or some plastic houses as well. This is the greenhouse in my backyard that I built, and not doing any kind of production. We're just in the business of growing a few house plants and things like that. I got the plans offline. So, nowadays you can go online and get all kinds of interesting information, including plans to build something like this if you want to be a hobbyist and have your own greenhouse. So this is an example here in a commercial house where these are Modine is the brand name of heaters. It has a fan jet. Typically, there would be a plastic tube attached here that would go straight down the house with holes perforated in it, and it would blow the heated air, or just air if it was not necessarily heated it was in the summertime, what have you, down over the plants. This has been reworked so that these the fan jets are now down on the ground and are blowing air up through the canopy of the plants. The reason they do that is to keep the plants dry. If you can exclude all the insects, as I mentioned, by using those fine screens, having a vestibule, that sort of thing. And if you can keep the plants dry throughout the production cycle, you can eliminate having to spray for either insects, any kind of pesticides, for insects or diseases. And that's a big selling point for greenhouse grown crops a lot of times. It's not organic because you are using inorganic fertilizers. But they'll oftentimes, market it as being pesticide free. This is, you can have a pretty high level of sophistication. Mechanized shade cloth pulled across this area in here. That tan is that fine screen that I was talking about. They just have these small fans to keep the air circulating, that sort of thing. So you can have as little or as much sophistication in terms of automation as you'd like. This is a picture of the greenhouses here on campus, some of the ornamental houses. And that's a picture of that, the cool cells. So that's about, it feels like cardboard, but it doesn't, fall apart like cardboard would when it's wet. There's a tank with a sump pump in it that's pumping water up into a trough on the top, and it trickles down. This material is about 6 inches thick, and it's wet, and on the opposite wall there'd be fans, exhaust fans, pulling air out of the house. So it's being pulled across these wet pads to cool the house. That's the way that works. They also have a level of automation in terms of, the side walls are automatically, based on temperature, can be opened and closed, motorized again. And this house is covered with that material, that polycarbonate that I was mentioned before. The level of sophistication in greenhouses can get a little overboard. You get a lot of stuff up in the superstructure of a house, and it actually starts shading the plants, and it's counterproductive in some cases. So here you see the heaters and a lot of the piping, and it's got shade cloth and fans and all sorts of things that can make it a little bit difficult, particularly in the winter months, to grow things. Hydroponics, as I say, is becoming a lot more popular. At the other extreme are the use of high tunnels or hoop houses, which are essentially unheated greenhouses. A lot of organic growers are interested in this kind of production. It is in-ground production. All of the things that you would normally do in, outside in production, crop rotation, things like that, they do inside the house. It is unheated, so it will extend the season for cool season crops, but you're not going to be growing watermelons or tomatoes or anything like that in these houses in the wintertime. These houses don't have end walls, but most of them will have end walls on the houses. And I'm not sure if they still do, but the NRCS, the National Resource Conservation Service, did have a program of financing hoop houses for growers. So they became very popular, like I said, with organic growers in particular. So the basic setup in terms of the fertility system, you have a water source, backflow preventer to prevent water from going back into your water source, whether it's a well or from whatever it is, whatever your surface water, etc. You typically will have 2 stock tanks. So the stock tanks will have your concentrated fertilizer solution. So the fertilizers that are used in hydroponic production are all water-soluble fertilizers. And the reason you have 2 stock solutions is because calcium nitrate, if it mixes with phosphorus material, phosphate, or magnesium sulfate, things like that, it'll form precipitates, calcium phosphate and things like that, that'll precipitate out of solution. So during the dilution, you're going to have some type of, a common brand name is a dosatron, which siphons the concentrated stock solution into your irrigation line and delivers it to the plants. When it's diluted in the siphoning system, it doesn't form those, it's only in the concentrated form that you have that problem. So you usually will have the 2 different stock tanks. As I say, the fertilizers have to be water soluble. Calcium nitrate is, for example, is a material that is formulated for both greenhouse and field use. So for field production, calcium nitrate is prilled in a pelleted form to be, put out by a, fertilizer spreader out on fields. The problem with it is if you use that in a hydroponic system, when you go to mix it with the water, the fillers that they use in there will form a scum on the solution, and it'll tend to clog up the system. So you have to use what's known as greenhouse grade cal nitrate, and that can, you can buy that from suppliers that supply that kind of material. This is another picture of a house, and in this house they're doing tomato production, and you can see that the tomato production in here has got some that are older and younger. The type of tomatoes and peppers and things that are grown like this are indeterminate types. So determinate tomatoes and peppers grow to a certain height, they produce fruit, it's harvested, and that's it. So if you've driven around South Georgia or Florida or other regions where they grow staked tomatoes in the field, you'll see the tomatoes get about 3 to 4 feet tall. These tomatoes will get 30 feet tall. And what they do is they trellis them up these lines, and then the line is coiled at the top on this wire. So when the plants get to the top here, they can unwind that and they'll just lean the plant over. So over time, the plants can be very long, and it's a very long season production. So, they usually start in September and production continues till usually the following June. So they're harvesting fruit every, week. They're pruning the plants. There's a lot of work that goes into the production in a greenhouse situation. You'll notice here the little lines here in this bag here. That's the irrigation system. So it's a drip irrigation system, which has supplying all the nutrients the plants need into the holes where the plants should be planted. And like I said, it's a relatively long season in terms of production. One of the things with tomatoes in particular that are coming out of greenhouses is, along with them marketing it as pesticide free in many cases, they also market it as being vine ripe. A lot of commercial field tomato production, the fruit are harvested when they're at the what they call mature green, or at the breaker stage. It's just starting to show a little pink. And then those would be put in a room with ethylene gas, which is a plant hormone that accelerates the ripening process. Whereas greenhouse grown tomatoes, it's vine ripe. We're picking it, red ripe, and it's being shipped to you. So the idea is that it's supposed to be fresher. This was some work that we did several years ago looking at the house that you're looking at here is what's known as a tobacco float house. And tobacco seedling production is done in these houses where they would flood the floor. You can see it's just a shallow area, but it's lined with a liner. It's flooded. And then we're using 4x8 insulation sheets with holes drilled in it to grow lettuce. For tobacco production, they would typically fill the house with what they call speedling trays, which are styrofoam trays that are floating on the water, and the water supplies all the nutrients. And that's what we were trying to do here. We just had a few that we were trying. Typically in tobacco production, the whole bed would be covered with tobacco plants. And because we're not covering the whole area, one of the problems that we encountered was a lot of algae would grow in the system. So the water would have to be treated with some kind of copper-based material to control the algae in this particular case. But hydroponic lettuce production is something that's done quite a bit, and this idea of using a float system like this is pretty common for it. Most of the lettuce that's going to be produced in houses like this are going to be loose leaf types like you see in the picture here. Some not doing as well as others. Lots of different colors. If you go to like Johnny's catalog, their seed catalog, they must have 30 or 40 at least different varieties of lettuce that they sell. When I was a kid, if we were going to have salad for dinner, what have you, you would buy a head of iceberg lettuce, and a couple of tomatoes, and that was chopped up and made into a salad. Iceberg lettuce, those heading lettuce that you see, those are grown out in the wintertime. It's grown in Yuma, Arizona, in that area, and then in the summer in Central California. And it's a very long season crop. It takes, in Yuma, Arizona, in the wintertime, it takes, 120 days to produce lettuce like that. This kind of lettuce, these loose leaf types, bib lettuce, different colors, some of it red and things like that. These loose leaf types are much faster. They're ready for harvest in, 45, 50 days. So, very fast turnover. A lot of these kinds of greens are also harvested when they're very young, what they call microgreens. The idea is to market them as, ultra tender and, real high quality. That's the key. So as I said, the media is generally inert, and some of the things that are used, I mentioned perlite, rock wool is another material. Just having PVC pipes that have holes drilled in it, which have, water circulating in the pipes, and the roots are suspended in it. In the picture there, those flats that you see, those are styrofoam flats, and that is, this is a seedling greenhouse. They're producing seedlings for production. But those are the kinds of flats that would be used that float in a float system, would be those, what they call speedling trays. This particular house has obviously pretty sophisticated. They have an overhead traveling irrigation system that they can use. And they probably also put out some pesticides, fertilizers, things like that in this system. But again, it's not a true hydroponic system. They are using soil in that, a potting media in those. So water-soluble fertilizers, all the plant nutrients are needed. So unlike field production, where you would be interested in supplying just these three nutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And in most fertilizers, what they call complete fertilizers, they'll have those three. If you go to the Home Depot, Walmart, those kind of places, they'll sell bags of fertilizers, and it'll be like 10, 10, 10, or 5, 10, 15, or 25, 7, 3, or something like that. And those three numbers are the percentages of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. But when you're dealing with hydroponics, you have to also supply all the secondary nutrients: calcium, magnesium, sulfur, and micronutrients. And so there are fertilizers, again, water-soluble fertilizers that are produced, that are available, that are specifically for hydroponic production. One of the things that's critical is the pH. In a field situation, the soils in Georgia generally are acid forming, so they tend to be on the acid side. Growers, they might test their soil every year, but they might have to adjust the pH by applying lime, which raises the pH maybe once every 3 or 4 years to keep it in the critical range. For field production, it's usually somewhere around 6.5 to 7. In a hydroponic system, the critical range, about 5.5 to 6.5 in terms of the pH range. But in a hydroponic system, it has no buffering capacity. What does that mean? So in a field situation, you typically would test your soil now, or maybe in September, and whatever the pH is low, you would lime it now. It takes 3 or 4 months for that lime to fully react in the soil and raise the pH. In a hydroponic system, there's no such buffering, so the pH can change radically and very quickly from one pH to another. So you have to monitor that and make sure you keep it in the range that it needs to be. And so that's one of the things you have to be concerned with. Because of that, it doesn't have that buffering capacity. As I mentioned before, you'll deal with 2 stock tanks for concentrates to avoid precipitates. So calcium nitrate and phosphorus materials can form these precipitates of calcium phosphate if it's mixed with magnesium sulfate. which is Epsom salts, it can produce calcium sulfate, and this will precipitate out. It can clog your system. So typically in one stock tank, they'll mix cal nitrate, again, a greenhouse grade, with iron chelates. That's the source of your iron in one solution. And in the other, you'll mix all the other materials. So this is what it looks like. They're using a couple of Ace Hardware garbage cans. These are dosatrons. That's the brand name. You can barely read it on there. But this is, what it does is it siphons the concentrated stock solution into your irrigation line. These on either end are just filters. You can unscrew them. There's usually some valve at the bottom. You can open them up to flush them. You can unscrew them to clean the screens if you need to. Valves to, help isolate different parts of the system. But that's basically how it works. These dosatrons here, they typically, you can dial in what the dilution you want. If you want it to be, 1 to 100 or 1 to 50 or something like that, you can do that. A simple one that's, I have here at my house, I put on the faucet outside, is called a hose on, which screws, it's a little brass thing that screws on the faucet, and you can drop a siphon tube in a bucket of concentrated fertilizer. And that works at, it's 15 to 1 is the ratio that works at. And, a small, home operation or something like that, that would probably be pretty adequate. A lot of research has been done on, greenhouse and other vegetable production in greenhouse, and particularly tomato production. And so they've come up with these tables like this. How much parts per million do you need of these nutrients at any specific time during production? So it's, you don't necessarily have to be this sophisticated, but bigger growers that are really into production and looking to hold down cost and produce, maximize their production, et cetera, will use these sorts of tables to mix their fertilizers. Milligrams per liter, which is the metric form of it, is the same as parts per million. So sometimes it might be easier to work with that than it might be to try to figure out the parts per million per se. Usually the bags of fertilizer, these water-soluble fertilizers will have instructions on them in terms of if you want to mix a solution that's, a specific parts per million, they'll explain on the bag how to do that. So again, the fertilizer is water-soluble, complete fertilizers with micronutrients. Typically 250 parts per million of nitrogen is, a good rule of thumb. 1 teaspoon per gallon of 20-20-20 fertilizer is will give you approximately 250 parts per million of nitrogen. And like I said, the fertilizer bags will have instructions and recommendations on them. This is an example here, and it tells you, what is in the bag, what materials. So this is a water-soluble fertilizer that's complete. So it has your NP and K here, 2310, it says right there on the bag. But it also is, it's also supplying lots of micronutrients, magnesium, a secondary nutrient there, et cetera. So it's, something like this, you can probably use it exclusively in this case. This is not all that important. It just indicates, how much it will change your pH, how much it'll make the pH go up if you use this particular product. Again, 2319, who the manufacturer is, where the material is derived from is also indicated, what they're using in there. And it gives you a table here of if you want to, how many ounces per gallon of concentrate, and some, information about how to mix it up, et cetera. And, what they're talking about here, EC, for example, that's electrical conductivity. And so these fertilizers are actually a type of salt. If you were to take table salt and put it in water, one of these meters that measures this electrical conductivity will, it'll register. But since you're using a fertilizer salt, it translates into an electrical current. So the electrical current is related to, it correlates with what the amount of parts per million of the nitrogen is in that particular solution. So that can be helpful. They're inexpensive, the meters, if you want to use them, and you can, stick it in the solution and it'll give you a reading, and that will tell you, approximately what your parts per million are in the solution. So there are, lots of different companies that produce these water-soluble fertilizers. Miracle Grow, you may have heard of them. They sell a lot of their product in Home Depots and Lowe's and Walmarts and such. Jack's, Peters, and the bags, they typically, for commercial production, would be in like 25-pound bags for greenhouse production. But and again, Walmart and Lowe's, those kind of places, they'll be smaller, usually 5-gallon containers, that kind of thing. Some of the crops that are grown in greenhouse production, tomatoes was the #1 crop grown. But leafy greens now are something that's, as I said, lots of different kinds of lettuce, spinach, even some of the brassicas like kale and things like that. Cucumbers, peppers, herbs, just about anything can be grown in this kind of a system. Perhaps not root crops though. So you're probably not going to be producing, carrots or onions or something like that in this sort of a system. The picture there that you're seeing of tomato production, you can see the plants, how, they get so long that they're sort of trellised along the ground and up into they're trellised up to that wire, and they're long enough that they're, the plants at the end of the season might be 30 feet long, like I said. Typically the fruit are harvested when they're red ripe, and they are harvested usually weekly. The plants are also pruned pretty regularly. So it's a fairly labor-intensive operation in terms of that. This is another production facility. Again, you can see, you'll notice in the alleyways here, there's a lot of plant material. That's because they go through and they prune them to keep them in line, and they snap out the suckers and things like that. Again, the systems, the plants are trained up these strings up to the top, where they have more string coiled so that they can uncoil it as they need to and lean the plants over to keep going. So the production, as I said, in tomato production, it's usually starts September to June. The plants can get very big. In this picture here, you can see, the plants have, they've gotten to the end of the greenhouse and they're starting to go back the other way. And so that's, pretty common in terms of tomato productions. The plants can get very, very big. And this is the way that they train them to do that. Again, the type of lettuce that is usually grown are these loose leaf types. This is a Bibb or Boston type that are grown relatively fast. You can, 40 to 50 days, you can produce a lettuce that's ready for sale. Sometimes they'll market them in these hard plastic clamshells. They're clear plastic, and they'll actually leave the roots on there, the white roots. They haven't been grown in soil, so they're perfectly clean. There's no soil or anything attached to them, so they'll put the whole head in a clamshell with the roots on there. And the whole idea is, the marketing is to sort of present it as being, it's farm fresh. It's right there. It's, they harvested it and it's on your dinner table in a couple of days. And of course, there are lots of different, lettuces now, lots of these colors and things like that. As I mentioned, when I was a kid, a head of iceberg lettuce and a couple of tomatoes. Now, bagged lettuce is a big business. Bagged greens of all kinds. It's not just lettuce. There's spinach. There's a lot of the brassicas, cabbage, kale, all those kinds of things that go into them. And that's become a big business, a big value added business to chop up a lot of different things, lots of different colors, and bag them like that. They oftentimes market them with, salad dressing in a packet in there, maybe some croutons as well. So it's, ready to go from that standpoint. This is pepper production. And again, this is a picture from South Korea. Again, the plants are indeterminate. So field pepper production, the plants probably only get green. This just means that they're immature. They charge you a lot more money if you want to get it in colors. So, but peppers, when they fully mature, will turn a color. Most of the green types will turn red, but they're, orange, yellow, purple, brown, black. I mean, there's a whole host of different colors that are available. And if you're, again, if you go to the seed catalogs, they'll have lots of choices in terms of the seed. Cucumbers are another one that are grown. On the right, the European type is a type of, those are the kinds that you see in the store that are oftentimes shrink wrapped. They've been individually wrapped, and that's to prevent them from desiccating. They are interesting in that they're parthenocarpic. That means they do not require pollination for the fruit to develop. On the left is a type called a beta alpha cucumber, and it was also developed for greenhouse production, but it looks more like a fresh slicing cucumber that we're more familiar with. Again, it's just a different variety that has been developed for greenhouse production. There was a grower down in Toombs County that grew seedlings for local growers. Their business was growing vegetable seedlings in the spring. So their houses generally sat idle for a good bit of the year. So they decided, let's try growing squash in a greenhouse. Squash does require insect pollination. And they thought, well, we'll grow it in a greenhouse. And it'll be an off-season, a winter crop, so maybe we'll get a little bit better price. You can see they've got them resting on these speedling trays. That's what that styrofoam tray is. It's been turned upside down on their racks that they have in their greenhouses. The black tube you see there is a drip irrigation line to irrigate the plants. They're planted in pots. This is what the house looked like. The sidewalls on this house here and here could drop down, to keep the house cool, had circulation fans. Because it does require insect pollination, they were using honeybees. And they had honeybees on the sides of the house. So the bees had access to both outside and inside the house. Typically, honeybees are not used in greenhouses. And the reason for that is because a typical hive will have, 15 to 20,000 bees. And if you disturb them, you're not going to be able to move fast enough to get out of there. So one of the things that is available for sale are bumblebees. You can actually buy bumblebee hives. They're usually about $200, $150, $200, something around that. They're shipped to you overnight. You set them up in the house, and they only have a few hundred bees in the hive. You open the door, and they go to work. The advantage of that is it's, with honeybees, you have to contract with a local beekeeper. They've got to transport the hives to your location. They've got to set them up. They got to come and pick them up, and they're gonna, they charge you for it and all of that. the bumblebees, you buy the bees, you get the bees, you open the door, the bumblebees come out. There's only a few hundred, and you think, well, they're not going to do as good a job, but each bumblebee is a lot more efficient than a honeybee. They're bigger, they're fatter. When they grab that flower, they're really shaking it. So you don't need nearly as many bees. They typically will last, 10 to 12 weeks, the hives, and they run out. So they're not self perpetuating like a honeybee hive is. I don't even think they have a queen in them, to be honest with you. But anyway, that is something, and you can go online and look it up. Natural Pole is the company that it's sold by a lot of different distributors, but that's the company that puts the hives together. Disease and insect control. One of the things is, as I mentioned, disease control, never wet the foliage. If you can keep your plants dry, chances are they're not going to develop any diseases. You can have a completely sealed greenhouse, have a vestibule, a little area that you have to step into, close the door behind you before you go into the house. You should not have to spray for insects, and if you have the house completely sealed. Again, so you can produce things that are what they call pesticide free. This is at again at some of the greenhouses here on campus, where they've put screening on the fan. This is actually an exhaust fan blowing out of the house, but they've enclosed it in some screening to prevent insects from coming in. This is another picture of that type of screening. That's ultra fine screening. You don't want to do this. Don't open the screen. Kind of defeats the purpose. You want to keep it closed and keep it sealed so that the house, you're excluding insects all the time. And then this was a small research greenhouse down at the University of Florida. And again, they had this vestibule. You had to go inside the vestibule, close the door behind you before you entered the house. And you had to step through a sanitary solution in this little vestibule area before you stepped into the house. Again, the idea is eliminate insects, eliminate diseases, and you can, if you're trying to sell the product, you can sell a pesticide-free product. And with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions. And everybody, please stay safe, keep your masks on, etc. Be happy to answer any questions. Let me go ahead and end
We have some questions in the chat. So David asks, is liquid oxygen a reasonable option for home hydroponics in a small room?
You really don't, the solution, if it's circulating through a system, however you're doing it, you should not need to have to put any kind of air or oxygen in there. I mean, there are, in experimental situations where people are doing it, where they're growing it in an individual jar or something like that, they might have that. But, the drip systems with perlite, there's going to be plenty of air there for the roots to, undergo respiration. If it's even with systems where it's totally just the roots suspended in water, the system circulates. There's enough aeration of that water. You don't really have to worry about that. Any other questions?
Yeah, someone asked, do tomatoes have the same pollination requirement as squash?
Tomatoes require, they are actually self-pollinated. But what happens outside, the wind is blowing, insects kind of disturb them a little bit, and that is enough for them to get pollinated. In a greenhouse, they do it one of two ways. One, they use the bumblebees as one way they do it. The other is just going around and disturbing the plants. And in fact, some people have taken things like, electric toothbrush and sort of modified it so they can go around and buzz the strings to get the pollen to fall onto the stigma in the flower. But the flower in tomatoes is, the corolla is fused around the stigma and the pollen is inside there. So it's generally self-pollinated. You just have to disturb the plant. Once you disturb the plant, the tomatoes will develop.
All right, and someone asked, can they use organic pesticides, I guess, in a hydroponic system?
Sure, you can do that. There are some things that you would be able to use. Remember though, a hydroponic operation is not organic, because you are going to be using inorganic fertilizers in the solution. But sure, BT, there's lots of things out there, Pyganic, etc., pyrethrin, what have you, that are available that you certainly could use in those situations. Follow label directions.
And yeah, my chat box got cut off, but I remember an earlier question someone asked, it might have been David. They asked, can you plant the seed of any crop basically in a hydroponic system and grow it any time of the year?
Theoretically, yes. There's, but as I said, probably root crops, things like carrots, potatoes, onions, that sort of thing, are probably not going to do all that well in that sort of a situation. There have been, typically the ones I listed, tomatoes, peppers, lettuces, cucumbers. Those are the ones that are most likely to be grown. There's a handful of them, but sure, you could produce corn plants in a hydroponic system. It might be a little bit unwieldy, or watermelons or anything. I mean, theoretically, it can all be done.
Mm-hmm. And how would you recommend pollinating zucchini squash in a small home hydroponics room?
You can do it by hand. The plants will produce male and female flowers. They're usually very big and yellow. The female flower will have a bulge at the base of the petals. That's what the fruit will develop from. You can find the male flowers that are shedding pollen. The flowers only last one day. So you'll, get the pollen from your male and just brush it onto that stigma in the female flower, and the fruit will develop. It's pretty easy to do. If you got a huge greenhouse, that's one thing. But if it's just a home operation with a few plants, it's certainly doable.
And is that also doable with watermelon plants?
Yeah, you can, but it would be a little bit more difficult. The flowers are smaller. They typically don't, not every female that you pollinate is going to develop. You usually can only have one fruit. You might be able to get 2 fruit per plant, and the fruit are going to be smaller in a greenhouse than they would be in a field situation. I mean, we do it for breeding work, but we're just interested in the seed, so we don't really care what size the fruit is. We're going to eventually grow it out in the field, and we'll get an idea of what it's going to do under production systems. But in a greenhouse, we're just, when we do that, it's to develop for seed, and it's, in theory, it should, you should be able to do it. Any flower should be able to, any female flower, once pollinated, should develop, but it doesn't always work out that way.
Mm-hmm. And Sharon asked, she's seen an aquaponics system, of course, where you have fish involved, and she's wondering, I guess, is there a difference in the pH, I guess, as far as the water, and roughly how big should the fish container be for plants?
We're getting out of my area of expertise. I would imagine the pH should be, basically what you need for the plants. Like I said, 5.5 to 6.5. In terms of the size of the tank, you can probably get away with, a 50-gallon tank or something like that, something relatively small if you were just going to have a few fish. It's all a matter of scale. If you're trying to do something commercial, obviously it's going to be much larger, but there's no, you can grow fish in a much smaller container.
All right, and David asked, is there a book or a paper that he could use for minimum PPF values?
PPF values.
What do you mean by PPF values, Mr. David? Oh, PAR lighting?
Okay, yeah, photosynthetic active. Yeah, yeah, you can find that kind of information, you know, online and stuff, you know, in terms of, you know, the wavelength and how much light you need for production. That shouldn't be too much trouble to do that.
All right, and then what would you say the average cost is to start a basic hydroponic system? I mean, you know, how much should we set aside for this?
Well, if you're just doing it at home, you can probably do it for, you know, a few $100s, under $1,000. You know, if you're doing a commercial operation, you know, you're probably looking at greenhouse and everything. You're probably looking at $20,000 and up in terms of putting in a house and things like that. Um, there's a company called Crop King that specializes in selling basically turnkey systems they would be a good one to contact. Atlas Greenhouses is a greenhouse producer here in Georgia. They would be a good source for houses. And of course, now with the internet and everything, you can sort of sit down and Google, and I'm sure there's plenty of other companies that you know, specialize in the supplies and things like that. And but again, for a commercial operation, you're probably looking at a minimum 20,000 just to put in a small house and going up from there.
All right. Does anyone have any more questions? And you can unmute yourself or you can use the chat. All right, so I don't see any more questions. So, Dr. Boyan, I just want to thank you for your time.
Sure thing, anytime.
For sure. I'm sure everyone appreciates it as well. So, again, if anyone would like a copy of this presentation or a link to this recording, you can email me. And of course, if you have more hydroponics questions, feel free to contact, you know, either me or Dr. Boyan, and we will definitely help you out.
All right, thanks, Brandon. All right, we'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.